Good afternoon, everyone. We are just going to give it a few more minutes to allow everyone to join us. See, the numbers are still rising. We're going to start a session shortly. All right, I think we're ready to start. Good afternoon again, everyone, and thanks for joining us in our first session of the Developing the Local Renewable Energy Value Chain series. If you have been following SAPVIA, SAWIA journey through last year, you would know that we ran a Developing Developers series, and which we concluded in March. And then we thought it was very nice and educational, and therefore it's something that we would like to continue. And we are today launching a new series where we are going to be focusing on business opportunities within the renewable energy value chain. And we are hoping that you are going to join us throughout the series as we're starting today, and just understanding the local content requirements. The future sessions will focus on each part of the value chain, and we're going to run the sessions from now up until October, where we have our sixth session. So today I'm joined by an esteemed panel of speakers who are going to share their expertise and knowledge. But before I get to that, I would like to acknowledge our partners. As I have said before, this session is a partnership between SAPVIA and SAWIA, which we put together to share educational content to the public of South Africa. And we partnered, or we have been supported by the Independent Power Producer Office, supported by the Black Energy Professionals Association and the Renewable Energy Entrepreneurs Forum of South Africa. And we are really proud of this partnership. And last but not least, I would like to acknowledge our session sponsor, Enertrack South Africa, who have been a really supportive even in the previous session. We're going to hear from them at the end of the session. So without further ado, I would like to kick off the session with our first presentation from the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition. We've got Mr. Gerrit Fourie, who is the Chief Director in Green Industries in the Industrial Competitiveness and Growth Branch at the DTIC. His previous roles have been in policy development, advanced manufacturing, ITC, trade and investment, as well as the tariffs and trade in the former ITEC. Mr. Gerrit Fourie, thank you so much for joining us and making time to share your knowledge and government strategies around industrialization and local content and how that informs development of the local value chain. Over to you, sir.
Good afternoon, everybody, and good afternoon, Tombi. Thank you very much for the invitation to be part of your webinar. I think this is a very exciting initiative, and I want to commend the industry for doing this. If you can put my...
Gerrit, you're sounding very, very far. I don't know if it's just on my side. If you can just speak into the microphone.
How is that? Can you hear me better?
Yeah, on our side, Tombi.
So thank you very much.
If you can just bring the mouthpiece closer to your mouth.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Right, thank you very much. And again, I would like to say thanks for the invitation to participate here. And I would like to commend the industry associations and industry for taking this initiative. You will see from my presentation that localization and industrialization is a big passion of mine, and it's also very important for government, and it's an integral part of government policy. So I'll give a Department of Trade, Industry and Competition perspective of the localization program of the Independent Power Program. Next. So I will cover just shortly why localization and industrialization. I'll give you an indication of the levers that are available to government that we typically use and that we can basically employ in this sector. Then I want to indicate some of the challenges we have and the way forward. Next slide, please. So I always like to start off by showing the challenge we have in South Africa. So this slide basically indicates the gross domestic product since 1994, and you'll see for the last 10 years our GDP has been in quite a bit of a decline. So the picture is not very nice. And I think a lot of this decline was driven by poor performance at state-owned companies. But why is GDP important to South Africa? It's basically the more we spend in the economy, the more demand there is for goods and services, and the more demand there is for goods and services, the more jobs we create, and the wealthier we become, and of course, wealthy people can spend more money on the stuff that they really want. So a very simple formula: how do we increase our gross domestic product? Basically, there are a few things we can do. We have to increase government and private sector and private individual spending in the economy. The spending will basically boost the demand for goods and services that create the jobs. The second thing we must do is we must reduce our imports. If we buy imported goods to large value, we basically create wealth in other countries, and we basically sponsor jobs in other countries. The third thing we can do is we must increase our exports. If foreigners buy from us, they basically create wealth in South Africa. And the last thing that's important is to drive investment. Next slide, please. So you'll see in South Africa, we've got quite an interesting structure in our economy. I'm not sure that's the right slide. The government spends about the gross domestic product in South Africa is about 20% of the GDP in South Africa, and imports make up about 30%. So there's really a big opportunity in South Africa to use government spending as a lever to drive this growth in gross domestic product. And the other big opportunity is to reduce our imports. Now, a lot of people might think this is a difficult situation we find ourselves in, but imagine yourselves in a small little island that's dependent on tourism. And during this COVID time, basically, they don't have many opportunities. And I think we're actually quite fortunate that we've got a lot of opportunities to really grow our South African economy. So basically what government decided already back in 2011 is to legislate localization and local content requirements as far as government procurement goes. Next slide, please. So basically the idea behind this legislation of government procurement is really to develop and enhance our local manufacturing capabilities, to use this massive government expenditure to create demand in the economy, support industrialization and technology development, create employment and sustain jobs, boost our export performance, and really try and get into the regional equipment manufacturers, global value chains. And then very important, on the back of all of this, support broader Black economic empowerment and Black industrialists. Next slide, please. So basically, what is available to government? How can we do this? The less popular way to do this is to curb the supply of imported goods. And basically, the way to do that is to use import duties. You can go very far and use extreme anti-dumping duties if products come in from countries where it's very cheap. In some cases, you can use import control. Many countries in the world use standards to curb the importation of goods and services, and there are quite a number of other things. The downside, of course, of all of this is it immediately increases cost. And I think in the renewable space, that's something we don't really want to see. We would typically like to find other measures to develop industry. Next slide, please. So a better levers to use is to use the government purchasing power that I've just described. And there are quite a number of programs already in place. The National and Industrial Participation Program and the Defense Industrial Participation Program, where government typically signs agreements with suppliers in very large contracts. We've got the Competitive Supplier Development Program, where state-owned companies would help develop local suppliers. One that's very, I think that is on everybody's mind right now is designation, where they use the preferential public procurement rules to basically force government entities to buy local. And then the Renewable Energy Independent Power Program that we're discussing today, and the local procurement accords, where there's basically agreement between industry, government, and labor. Next slide, please. So what typically happens when there's we use these levers is that in the bid conditions, government and state-owned entities would have to specify the local content required, and during the bidding phase, the bidders must declare the local content that they will achieve. And when it comes to the evaluation stage of bids, it's a two-stage process. The first stage, you look at the local content and the functionality. If you don't make the local content, the bid is basically disqualified. And then the second stage, we look at broad-based Black economic empowerment and price. So that is a normal way of doing things. And then, of course, there's a system of verification and record keeping and checks to make sure procurement managers comply with these requirements. Next slide, please. So the IPP office, and I must just say here, the Department of Trade and Industry's role is basically to provide advice and guidance to the IPP office. We don't have any authority over this program. So a lot of what you see is based on recommendations we've made in the past. I have implemented some of our recommendations, but a big part of the program is basically designed by the IPP office. They implement it, they monitor it, and they control it. So what they've typically done is use the system of 70 points weighting for price and 30 points weighting for what they call economic development criteria. And to do this, they, over the years, typically got exemption from the normal procurement rules in government, and they also got exemption from certain parts of the codes of good practice in the Black Economic Empowerment Act. And then they basically pooled localization and the typical BE requirements under what they call economic development elements. And I mean, we've always been of the view that Black economic empowerment should rather be a gate, and it shouldn't count as a weight. And it made it relatively easy in the past, it's our view, to score quite high on this economic development criteria, because the traditional Black economic empowerment targets were given quite a large weight, and you'll see the local content was basically given 25% of 30 points. So that's basically lower than 10 points out of the total. So our recommendation has always been to increase this local content weighting. And you'll see at the bottom, the way it was typically reported in the past is as a single percentage. So it was relatively easy, I think, to achieve a relatively high score on the economic development criteria. Next slide. Okay, so what I've done here now is in the risk mitigation round that we just going through right now, the IPP office made quite a significant change from the way they did things in the past. They introduced the designation. So these are the products that it's compulsory to buy local under the Preferential Procurement Framework Act. And you'll see there are two that has got a big influence on the renewable industry: the solar PV components, where the compulsory local content is 15 to 65%, and steel products and components for construction. It's got a required local content of 100%. So wind towers that are manufactured, all wind towers must be manufactured using South African steel. That's the requirement under the designation. And our view is that it's gone quite a long way to really drive home the point that localization and industrialization is important. And I think the one thing that we're quite keen to investigate going further is whether we should designate wind towers themselves to ensure the industry, the local industry and local manufacturers can really reduce their risk and grow the market. Next slide, please. So in short, the challenges we've seen over the last few years, I think one of the biggest challenges we see is this renewable energy industry and the green economy as a whole provides a massive, massive economic opportunity for South Africa. It's, in my view, almost a silver bullet to many of our problems. But many people don't perceive it as that. Many people perceive the renewable energy as a threat. And I think one of the reasons for that is in the past performance, the industry hasn't really provided the localization and the value add that one expected from it from the start. Then the big problem, I think, with the renewable program is what we call matching supply and demand. You typically have these bidding rounds, and they don't really have a continuous rollout. So there's very high demand that often exceeds supply, and the next year there might be very high supply that doesn't match the demand. So that's one of the big things we have to address. The other thing we've picked up is, are we really, when we discuss these things, talking to the decision makers in the industry? I mean, we've seen in the last few months a lot of lobbying, a lot of newspaper articles, and there appears to be a lot of, unfortunately, rent seekers in the industry that don't really support the socio-economic responsibilities that we require from lead companies in our economy and basically in any big economy in the world. Then I think another challenge is that the bulk of the opportunities in the renewables is seen to be in the construction phase. And I think if we can grow the manufacturing sector, that perception will definitely change of the renewable sector. There's always a request for incentives in this industry. And I mean, what we have to realize is this economy with this COVID that we've gone through, sitting with massive, massive debt. So our view is going forward, a coordinated approach between industry, government, labor, and all the main stakeholders, the foreign OEMs, is basically what we need to grow this industry. And then our last challenge we identify is the REIPPPP program. Probably they've got too many objectives, and there should be a prioritization. Maybe the way to this approach to follow is this two-stage bidding, where you first industrialize and then you look at price and broad-based Black economic empowerment. Last slide. So the way forward, we've been busy, and I think many of you know that, for the last couple of months with the South African Renewable Energy Master Plan. And the main purpose of the master plan is basically to put a plan together that supports industry growth, but it's got the buy-in of all the key stakeholders in the industry. And many of the challenges I've indicated now is the master plan is tasked with addressing that. And I've put the contact details up of the master plan project manager. So anybody is welcome to contact him if you would like to make inputs into the master plan. Then the other, I think, big change this year is that growing the green economy is now a key performance indicator for many governments. For example, the DTIC, every branch in the DTIC has a key performance indicator to grow the green economy, and they have to report on a quarterly basis on that. And if you listen to our minister's budget vote speech 2 days ago, it's very clear that the green economy is seen as this massive opportunity going forward, and the expectation is that this economy will deliver big time on industrialization, localization, job creation, and the creation of service industries. And then I'm not sure everybody is aware of this, but the big opportunity going forward is there's huge demand from Europe for hydrogen-based aviation fuel from South Africa. They prepare to pay extensive subsidies on this type of fuel, and the requirement is the hydrogen-based fuel has to be manufactured with renewable energy. So if we can pull this opportunity off, it means a massive increase in especially solar PV in South Africa, but I'm sure wind and biofuel as well. So I think I'll stop there. I hope it was a good introduction, and thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Gerard. I think the acknowledgement of the challenges that is faced with regards to localization and industrialization in the renewable energy space is really good to hear, especially coming from government, especially the fact that there's too many objectives, and sometimes we have too many balls in the air, and it gets difficult to achieve everything that we want to achieve. But I hope that if we work together as industry with government, we will be able to find some common ground to achieve localization. Thanks so much, Gerard. And those who have questions for Gerard Fourie, we please ask you to post your questions in the Q&A function. And for the rest of the speakers, please do the same. We will address the questions in the end, and Niveshan Govender will take us through the Q&A session. I would also like to apologize to those who are going to see this webinar on video. We've had challenges admitting everyone that has registered because of our platform is acting up. So we will make the video available, and we'll make the slides available. Marilise, can I hand over to you? You wanted to do the switch before we carry on with the program. Just give me a thumbs up if everything is okay. Okay, thank you. All right, we're going to continue with our program. I've got a couple of speakers lined up. We are going to hear the solar industry perspective from Maloba Tsetla, who's from ED Platform. We're going to hear the wind industry perspective on localization from Daniel Erasen Moda from GRI Tower, South Africa. And then we are going to hear perspective on local content verification and monitoring from Desmond Gavenda, who used to work for the SABS for a long time, heading up the local content verification office. And then in the end, we'll hear from Letlogonolo, who is from Enetrek, who's going to just giving them a spotlight because they have sponsored the webinar. Give us the sponsor's perspective on this. Next slide, please. Yeah, so without further ado, I'm gonna hand over to Maloba. Maloba, a proud Mosotho, is the head of strategy and growth at ED Platform. He is responsible for managing the inter-team collaborations and improve business value offering and efficiency. Maloba, I've known him for a very long time. I think Gerard would remember, he took us through the Western Cape a couple of years ago. And it's good to have you in the panel. And he has worked for the Innovation Hub before, and he's also worked for the Green Cape. Over to you, Maloba. We look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Ntombi. It very much is a small sector. We keep meeting each other in different roles, and it's always good to do so. Next slide, please, Mary-Elise. This looks like the end of my slides. Okay, maybe the order has just been messed up. Okay. No, something has happened to the order. Would I be able to maybe share from my end?
Let's try that, Maloba.
Is that possible? Yeah, please. Just going to need to enable me to share, please.
Yes, you are now co-host, so you can share the slides from your side.
Can you see my slides, Toby? Okay, perfect. So apologies for that, everyone. So I'm just going to share the perspective from the solar PV sector. But I think before I start, I just want to, thank Gerard for sharing his view. And it's really good to see that there's very much alignment between our view on what's possible and what the DTIC, is looking forward to and asking of the industry. And I think it's quite important to find that alignment between, where the policy is looking to go and what the market can do in order to meet that. So in my presentation, I'm just really going to look at how the requirements within the economic development program section of the program that Gerard has introduced have changed over time, and some of the considerations around that. So I think to start with, there's been a move in the latest round of the renewable energy program away from having economic development as a competitive element to something that projects need to comply with. This in and of itself is neither a good or a bad thing, but it is quite a fundamental shift in the structure of the program And I think it has multiple consequences depending on the specific element of economic development that you're looking at. But just a bit more detail, as Gerard had noted that in previous rounds, evaluation was done 70% on price and 30% on economic development. But what we've seen in the risk mitigation program is that it then became 90-10, I think closer aligned to BBBEE evaluation. And then whereas in bid window 5, which is ongoing, ED is no longer part of your competitive evaluation and is only a qualification requirement. So that removes any creativity or any incentives that projects might have to exceed any thresholds that have been set, and it just leaves it almost at achieving things at the threshold. That said, if we look at what I'll do in the next slide is just to look at the thresholds in bid window 4 versus in bid window 5, and I think there's some interesting trends that we can see there. As Gerard also introduced, that there was the inclusion of designated local content, which has made, I think, another fundamental shift in the nature of the program. And I'm making these points to build up to sort of some observations at the end of this, so just bear with me. So this table gives us a comparison between, to the left, if we look here on thresholds and targets, what was in bid window 4, and this last column here are the thresholds that have been set in bid window 5. For most of them, what we can see, those that are in green, is that the threshold, which is now the qualification criteria, which is that if a project doesn't meet it, it cannot even participate in the evaluation stage. These thresholds, for the most part here in green, are higher than the thresholds that were set at bid window 5. So they in terms of a trend in economic development, that projects need to contribute, this is increasing higher than those thresholds. Of course, in some instances, the thresholds that are set are even higher than the targets. You know, for example, if we look at ownership in terms of shareholding by Black people in material contractors, that is above the target that was set. So there's significant progress in a positive light in this regard. Local content has remained the same, specifically for PV, but there's again another shift in how local content is determined across your entire project, which I think we'll make a note on at the end. We see some of the elements that didn't have thresholds in the beginning, like preferential procurement, enterprise development, etc., now being set at a threshold. Even if that isn't as high as the target, it does ensure at least a floor performance in terms of each project, looking at the various sub-elements. So on the one hand, setting a threshold means that we can absolutely expect a certain level of contribution or a certain amount of contribution to the various economic development elements at each project. On the other hand, it means where a project may have been able to go beyond the threshold, and by doing that be positively advantaged or advantaged in terms of scoring, we may lose some of that value. So that's another option that has to be weighed in terms of these changes that are made to the program. But to speak specifically to industrialization and localization, what does the industry need to move? I think the one part of this process is what Gerard has covered, which is why there's localization policies. We want to drive economic development and ultimately see jobs being created for South Africans in South Africa and investment money flowing into the local economy. And so that is where the policy is pushing things. And the question is, what is industry's part and what does industry need to play its part in meeting that call? one of the things that I think has been said time and again in the renewable energy industry is consistency in the implementation of policies. So from the IRP and its rollout continuously to requirements around localization, getting a clear signal on where are we going towards this. When we move from this level to the next, this is what it's going to be, this is what it's going to look like, these are the timelines that we can anticipate. Clarity as well, and the signals. I think the increase over time in the local content threshold provides the kind of signal that says to projects, we can expect that this should increase and we should therefore make investments into qualifying local suppliers so that we can increase our local content. It gives signals to OEMs and investors to say there is consistent implementation of policy, and we can see that there's going to be an absolute need for the localization of this component. I'm going to set up a factory. And then with that, consultation and collaboration. So testing with the industry players, both from developers, manufacturers, investors, asset managers, on where is the market in terms of meeting this call to localize. What currently is the most viable thing and the most impactful thing to localize. And these requirements aren't in a vacuum. There are examples of these signals and clarity being in place and investment following. So I think the next speaker is an example of that. TRI is set up in South Africa on the back of the IRP and the rollout of the REIPPP. There's multiple other companies that have come as a response to this. And the mechanisms exist, right? Those mechanisms exist in which government can provide these signals and this consistency, this consistent implementation. So the rollout of the IRP and its updates. I know there's calls from many quarters about updating the IRP, whether it's yearly or bi-yearly or every 3 years, but really enabling the IRP to look at technologies development, price development, and the requirements of the system, and therefore reshape itself to meet all of those and to optimize for whatever the country wants to optimize for. So is it better prices? Is it for more jobs? And having an IRP that is reflective of the status quo. And then designation is another very powerful mechanism, and our view is that if we look at the solar value chain, and this is part of the work that we're hoping that through the SIREM process we'll get to a very good point with. If we look at the solar value chain and we do the assessment of per unit output of a certain component, where are the most jobs created? Where's the most money flowing locally? What is the easiest to sustain? And maybe not having things that necessarily depend on government procurement being as consistent as we might want it to be, but can also export, can also feed into other markets like the embedded generation market. But having research-led selection of what is it that we're going to designate, what are the levels in this round, in the next 2 rounds, in the next 3 rounds, which can provide the signals for investment decisions to then be made, and then progress those thresholds in that way, in the same way that Black ownership in projects, in contractors has increased over time, and the market has moved in order to be able to respond. And of course, this then trickles down into the economic development requirements that projects have to meet. And I think that table we saw of bid window 5 from bid window 4 provides an example that we can move up. We can move those requirements up, and the market is responding, right? But when we look into the sub-elements of that, we do need to look very carefully at what are those levels, and is there sufficient, for example, capacity? Are the selected components the most advantageous ones for South Africa? And the basis for that is quite important as well. And then a point that I really, recommend we look at is localization beyond local content, right? So what else is in the value chain? So we have the key components panels for the PV sector, frames, modules, inverters, batteries. We have the wind towers in the wind energy sector, nacelles, blades, etc. But what else? What else is in the balance of plant equipment and components and activities that happen beyond site, which can and already are local content, but can be enhanced? What are those opportunities in the rest of the value chain that we can really support so that other businesses that aren't primarily renewable energy businesses, but can tap into this market and therefore sustain themselves, enhance their job security, possibly create more jobs, but contribute to the local content requirement so that we have an economy as a whole that is widely benefiting from this program or this sector, as opposed to a niche set of businesses that only do renewables. I think skills is another area, making sure that as we have all these OEMs come into place, set up the equipment, operate these facilities, that we make sure that these skills are transferred into South African hands. So youth, young South Africans getting these required skills, across a whole set of things from design to project management. And then of course, services as well. That's a huge part of having projects come to life, are the supporting services, across the legal, design, technical, economic development, advisory that support these projects. And those are part of what I think we need to not forget when we talk about local content, because those are jobs that are sustained through the sector, and can either enhance existing businesses, which can now move into renewables and add that as part of their value offering, and therefore become more sustainable. So I think just to find a balance between the extreme focus on the manufacturing of components, not to let that go, but to also make sure that we support other businesses that contribute to these projects, and contribute to local content ultimately. So I've highlighted a series of economic development requirements in the Bid Window 5 scorecard, where it says new element. That is a new addition to the scorecard, which has its own opportunities for the sector to really grow. And the first one here is designated local content. As I've spoken about, there is, I think, a need to drive local designation with a very keen understanding of where the market is, where technology is, and I think it speaks to the point that Gerard raised around what is the objective. Do we want the cleanest energy on board? Do we want the cheapest energy coming on board? Do we want the highest job creation or economic development that we can get? Or are we happy with a balance, and where is that balance? And having that inform how we use mechanisms like designated local content, whether it is the levels of it or it is the process of allocating the designation of various components. But I think in that collaboration with industry, touching base with where global trends are, we can find a position that works, and then keep improving and keep increasing as the program has shown it's able to do. I think another area is skills development that wasn't existing in previous bid windows. And it's really good to see it here, because like Gerard has said, this is now aligning closer to the BEE codes, but also this then allows the sector to do a long-term investment. And I think if we take this opportunity up to do a long-term investment into creating skills that will then allow the true localization of renewables, which is projects that can then be developed by South Africans and by Black South Africans, by young South Africans, projects that can be built and overseen by South Africans, and get to a point where projects can be funded and managed by Black and South African entities. And I think things like skills development and supplier development, which is also a new element, enables us to get to that point. And so if we take the time to implement these with a view that over time, maybe the requirement is going to be 51% South African entity participation and 51% Black ownership. But there has been time through these elements to build that kind of a base and that skill set and the ability to do that. Another element here is procurement from Black enterprises. And I think this is quite an important one, in that as we move away from those key technology components, right, and we start saying, what else can we procure across a value chain? And we can procure from Black-owned enterprises. This, for me, speaks to that rest of the localization possibility, right? Having Black South African-owned entities participating in this market. Maybe they're purely renewable entities, or they're entities that do other businesses but can latch onto the renewable energy drive and therefore become more sustainable. I think this is a really good development and should signal to the rest of the market that, hey, there is actually this huge opportunity within renewables. And then our part as the renewable energy sector and as government is to then enable, and I think programs like this and the Developing Developer series that Sawaya and Satya did, help to start informing participants, potential participants, of what it means and what it takes to participate and how to do it, and connecting them potentially with developers, investors, technology providers. Right. So, yeah, I think most of these points around designated local content specifically for solar PV I've covered. And one of the things that I think is quite important to mention at this point is the ongoing in industry around, you know, the local capacity to deliver what is designated, because designation effectively means if you're not able to meet this threshold, this project is out of the running, you know. So local capacity presently and what is planned and how we bridge that risk. I don't think the issue is around, oh, there's nothing now and there'll never be anything. But if I need to put in a project now for capacity that's coming in the future, how do I mix that risk into my program? And how do I have the structures to support me in order to close if I'm a successful bidder? And those conversations, I think, need to happen and be built into the program or considered when these requirements are put together, so that we then are able to execute on this program and it's not delayed. And then also, you know, making sure, again, that updating of things like the IRP and designation on where the global standards and where is technology driving to, and what is it that we are chasing as an objective. So is it cheap energy? Is it purely economic development? Is it a mix? And let's see that mix filter into ultimately these mechanisms to drive localization. And I think when that balance is found through that interaction and iteration with industry partners and other stakeholders, then there's willingness from the sector, because ultimately if we can solve for that, then projects can come online, and that's ultimately the thing that industry wants to see, you know, as part of their contribution to solving the current load challenges and moving to a just transition. So how do we drive this? I mean, the two big things that I'm suggesting are research and introspection, and then that strategic consultation, right? So, for example, with Satya, many years ago, I think around 2012, we did a localization study on PV. It is probably time to do another one, but one that looks at what have we been able to do, what is currently the most competitive and advantageous for South Africa, and what do the levels look like in terms of the local content that PV projects can achieve. Maybe it's beyond 45. Maybe the designation is slightly different, structured slightly differently, or maybe it's increased, but we need to have that kind of decision-making driven by empirical data. And I think that's something that we're very keen to contribute towards, both in the SARIM process and otherwise. Right? And then driving these focus on these areas. So if there are other components in other areas where we can increase this localization, then let's drive that, but let's have the data that drives that kind of decision making. And then in terms of that strategic consultation and development of policy, I think the SARIM process, like Gerard has said, is absolutely critical to that. So we're fully on board, I think, as all renewable energy sectors and associations, to drive the outcomes of the SARIM, so that then drives the policy and it's driven from a point of joint acceptance on it, and then we'll be able for industry to respond because the inputs have been made, and then we're avoiding unrest and complicated programs and then possible delays and other unintended consequences. But yeah, let me leave that for now. Thank you very much, Dumbi.
Thank you very much, Maloba. Thank you eloquently broken down the rules and requirements and brought us to a certain level of understanding of what it means to comply with the requirements and what it means for the development of the value chain. There's a couple of questions for you in the Q&A, but we deal with that at the end of all the presentations. Thanks, Maloba. Can we go to the next slide? And slideshow, please. All right, we move on with our program. We're gonna now hear from Daniel Erasin-Mora, who is a managing director for GRI South Africa. He's been with the industry since 2008, and before coming to South Africa, he spent 7 years in Brazil, holding several executive roles. I must say also that Daniel is a very active member of SAWEA Manufacturers and Local Content Working Group, and we are very pleased to have him here to share his insight. Over to you, Daniel.
Thank you, Ntombi. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for giving the industry the opportunity to provide the inputs. Thanks as well to Gerard and Maleva for the inputs, which I find quite interesting, and we will see a lot of common grounds with what the wind industry is identifying in this process. So next slide, please. We are gonna split the presentation into basically two parts. On the first part, we're gonna look into the global value chain and going into the opportunities of what is being localized, what else can be localized. Okay? And in the second part of the presentation, we are gonna talk about the environment that we think needs to be developed for those opportunities and those investments to take place. Okay? Next slide, please. So this is a general overview of what is the global value chain on the wind industry, where we see the developing business, we see the EPC, we see the original equipment manufacturers, and the operation and maintenance phase. And I'm sure that Gerard will be familiarized with the other table that is part of some of the DTI documents of what are the localization main cost buckets and sub-items demonstrated, with a slightly different angle, but still putting the approach on key components, on EPC or balance of plants, and grid connection and other cost buckets. Now, let's move to the next slide, please. When we look to components, because still the angle of our presentation is to look for opportunities in the manufacturing value chain. So the main components of a wind turbine generator is basically the foundation or anchor cage in the tower, the nacelle, and the rotor. Next slide. Next slide. How the industry approach the manufacturing of these components worldwide. So basically, the standard business practice is OEMs manufacture in-house certain components and usually decide to outsource to independent suppliers other ones. So the standard practice is that the OEMs usually focus their investment in terms of manufacturing facilities in nacelles and hubs, and usually seek for long-term partnerships with independent suppliers for manufacturing anchor cages, towers, and blades. Also, in certain regions, they might have different approaches. Next slide, please. So when we look what is being currently localized in terms of main components in South Africa, the first thing that we need to bear in mind is the local manufacturing is crucial, or maybe I should say was crucial in the economic development component, and as it is the basis of long-term sustainable employment opportunities. As it's been mentioned in some of the previous presentation, there is a swift change on the scorecard that raised some concern on the industry. But when we look what is going on the country since the launching of the REIPP, we see that the only main component that has been successfully localized so far is now. So there has been a facility that was built and entered into operation in Cuja, Port Elizabeth, but unfortunately closed down and went into liquidation. And we will dig into the causes that of trigger this the losing of this investment. There is another independent steel tower facility, which I represent in Atlantis, Western Cape. There has been several sites to manufacture successfully concrete towers developed by one specific OEM. And there has been as well a successful rollout on the local manufacturing anchor cages. Next slide, please. So when we look into opportunities, the first thing that I want to reiterate and highlight, that all the various parties that belongs to the Sahuia Local Content Working Group, in particular the OEMs and manufacturers, have shown that the industry has appetite and has willingness to undertake further commitments, but we need the regulatory basics in place, and that is what I will refer afterwards when I talk to the environment that needs to be facilitated for investment and job creation being triggered. Okay, from this commitment, potential investment that could be materialized should be by means of expansion of current or new manufacturing capacity of towers on both technologies, concrete and steel, the arrival of independent blade manufacturers, and the arrival of potential nacelle and hub assembly facilities. Okay? But we want as well to give important focus today on range of opportunities and products that can be supplied by what we call tier 2 suppliers, which are basically sub-suppliers of the main component manufacturers, and that open significant amount of opportunities for a small and medium enterprise with a sustainable manufacturing. And I would like now to move into next slide, where we are going now into identifying and point out some of these tier 2 opportunities. Next slide, please. So worldwide, this is not only a South African approach. The manufacturing of main components used to attract not only government but OEM interest because of the magnitude of the investment and the direct impact of job creation. So while these industries on their own has a major impact, what today we want to put into context and highlight is that the opportunities that these industries trigger into the local supply chain. I'm gonna give now the opportunity to put into context in our specific sector, the manufacturing of steel towers, and taking into consideration the round 5 volumes. So opportunities components that can be and some of them they're already being locally manufactured. So round 5 in terms of volume would mean around 80,000 to 100 tons of steel plates, 4,000 tons of steel in anchor cages, more than 6,000 tons on rebars for foundations, 3,500 tons of steel, more than 600,000 liters of paint locally manufactured, more than 200 tons of industrial gases for the industry, around 500 tons of internal aluminum platforms, and a huge amount of electrical cables and power cables. So this is real. Some of these already happened in round 3, in round 4. Also, still a significant portion of these materials has been imported. There is capabilities and there is opportunities to localize, to fully localize this supply chain. Next slide, please. So again, taking as a reference point only the tower or the steel tower, I'm showing here a wide range of subcomponents like ladders, access ladders, galleries, guardrails, internal platforms, doors and door frames, structural bolts and transport kits that can be easily localized, some of them already localize and this open opportunity for that sector that we are referring that is so important to create new jobs. Next slide, please. Here, just some visual examples of internal platforms. Next slide, please. Access ladders that has been already manufactured locally. Next slide, please. Structural balls and transport kits. Okay, so these are just some of the examples and opportunities beyond what's a tower or a steel tower for the wind to regenerate. Next slide, please. So we want to use as a platform to say, listen, that is only from the angle of the perspective of now figure out if you are capable to localize other main components as nacelles and blades. What are the opportunities around the industry that can be created? And here you just see a brief listing of materials that if one of those facilities of components become localized and trigger shafts, bearings, brake systems, pitch system, gearbox generators. So I don't have that expertise on these other main components. That's what I've been a bit more into the detail in the case of the towers. But what we're trying to say is that this is the reality. This is what can trigger the arrival of further investments. Next slide, please. So being pointed out to some of the opportunities on the manufacturing. Now what we want is to put into context as well what is the environment that needs to be built to attract those investments. And we have broken down into two different angles. The first angle is market and regulatory challenges to be addressed. Next slide, please. And you're going to find a lot of common ground here with what Gerard has been mentioned on his presentation and Malova has been mentioned. So the first is lack of continuity and predictability. This industry needs long-term interrupted market to justify manufacturing investments. Okay, and auctions needs to be predictable schedule on an annual basis to roll out the 2019 IRP. So what we want to comment on this one is that we have a wonderful context defined by the 2019 IRP, okay, with a very exciting volume of 1.6 gigs of wind to be rolled out annually for the next 8 years, okay, but needs to be rolled out consistently and predictably, okay, because we already see that we have gaps on the implementation between the transition from round 3 to round 4, or very painful and cost an investment of almost 400 million rands in Port Elizabeth to close down. It's happening now again on the transition in between round 4 and round 5. And it cannot happen. It cannot happen again if the goal again is to try to attract manufacturing. Yeah? Industry will not be sustainable if we continue on a stop-go mode. Okay. Local content procurement rules. Yeah. They need to be clearly defined and timelessly defined. I mean, industry, as I have mentioned, has the appetite and has the commitment to join the party, but we need to give them the framework, okay, and the time to roll out the requirements. Okay, the objectives need to be consistent through the different windows and not to be overcomplicated. Something that we need to bear in mind is that the manufacturing also of these main components is extremely specialized industry and is driven by economies of scale, which basically means that most of these facilities cannot be reconverted to manufacture alternative products if there is a market stoppage. So that talk again on the to the angle of being consistent and being predictable with continuous volume for the industry, so the industry can afford investment and can continue growing and creating jobs. Next slide, please. Verification needs to be improved. Okay, so the local content rules should not be only observed, but audited and verified to avoid opportunistic behavior. We have been witnessing several cases in the previous rounds. And if the goal is to create and attract local industry, that this needs to be properly in place, as well as tariff heading codes for imported wind components and subcomponents must be scrutinized if we want to develop and protect a local industry. Finally, there has been, we are of the view there has been a poor enforceability and not enough transparency on the non-compliance penalties. So exemptions, the exception needs to be revisited and limited to case of technically unavailability of components. Otherwise, we jeopardize the effort to create a local industry. And the finance penalties for underperforming needs to be revisited. They need to become more severe and being uniformly applied. Okay. Next slide, please. So what the industry requests is a knock-on effect of what we have mentioned in the previous slide. Next, please. We need predictability, policy consistency, and clear regulatory framework. Okay? So it's the only way. The market is there. It's a long-term market. We need to be sure that that long-term market is honored with annual allocation of megawatts, so the industry can justify the investment. There needs to be a clear, reliable, and long-term policy in localization to attract, and substantiate, and motivate those investments. And there needs to be a clear definition of the local content and of the measurement. And this is what we think is the success formula. If there is a reliable and stable market demand, and there is a transparent regulatory framework, we have no doubt that there will be investment coming to South Africa that triggers significant job creation. We need flexibility. Not all the OEMs might have the same approach or what they need, what they want to localize and when. So we need to build the framework for having such flexibility. And finally, and especially, this is what we think is a must. DTI, REIPPPP office, and Department of Mineral Resources. They need to work together to build a fair, consistent, and level playing field. If the aim is to facilitate and to attract investment, we need to provide that safe environment. So OEMs will certainly be capable to, under those conditions, to build a remarkable, sustainable industry. So I think those are some of the reference. And Tommy, I committed to be within time. Okay, so that's it from my side.
Thank you so much, Daniel, and for sticking to your time allocation. That was awesome, and thank you very much for just breaking down especially the challenges, but also coming up with recommendations of what needs to be done. I specifically, from both presentations, like the fact that you highlight that it's not just about the large components. Localization can be achieved through the value chain. Smaller components might create more jobs and perhaps attract more investment, and we need to look through the value chain. And I think Maloba highlighted the same thing as well. So I appreciate that. There is a couple of questions for you. So if you can stay until the end of the session.
Thank you. Thank you,
Tommy. Can you put up the slides? Thank you. So our next session, so now we've heard from the industry, we've heard from government, but I think the question that keeps lingering in people's mind is, okay, there's local content. How do we make sure that it's properly verified? What is committed is actually checked, that it's implemented in a way that has been committed. So I've got Desmond Govender, who works for Global Certification Solutions as Managing Director. He previously worked for the SABS, South African Bureau of Standards, as a General Manager for Local Content Verification Office. So he's got a lot of experience across different industries on local content verification. And we really look forward to hear his insights in terms of, is it even possible? Does government even have capacity to monitor and verify the local content that is committed to ensure that we have a level playing field, because it is a competitive environment. So looking forward to hear from you, Desmond, and over to you.
Thank you. Well, Tommy, thank you for the opportunity to give you some insight into the local content verification process. As mentioned by yourself and to our colleagues that are participating, I have been previously at the South African Bureau of Standards, so I do understand the local content verification process, but I must make mention that the process still remains with the South African Bureau of Standards with regards to the verification agency that they belong to, the DTI. So but if you can go to the next slide, thank you. My learned colleague Gerard has highlighted how government has used the lever for public procurement for the local industry. So this is a little bit of a repeat, but I must make mention that the DTI has set up the machinery to ensure implementation of designations with the support of National Treasury. As you know, there has been many instruction notes that have been issued by the National Treasury that has been developed by the DTIC. So in 2012, SABS was appointed the verification agency to actually verify these self-declarations that the suppliers have made for all these designated sectors. And during the period of 2013, the first local content certificate was issued to the bus body sector that had looked at the bus industry within, I think it was within Gauteng and Johannesburg specifically. The next slide, please. So the first question we ask ourselves is, how does the verification process start? So I looked at the bid window 5 RFP and some documentation. So we need to understand what local content means. And with regards to this, it means the economic development element which measures the utilization of South African products in the development, completion, implementation, operations, and maintenance of project as per the undertaking of project activities. And these products relate to the utilization of raw materials, manufactured parts, component, utilities, and services. Further to that, it also means the value of expenditure in respect to the items falling within the designated sectors. So you'll find that designated sectors have been mentioned by Gerard as well, but also components or product that constitutes local production and content measured in accordance with requirements of National Treasury designated sector circulars. And then local content spend means the portion of the total project that is respective to South African products. So the process of local content starts with understanding what is local content from a definition point of view. And I think here it was made pretty clear, and it would obviously need further kind of understanding as to what manufacturing means. But in most cases, it would mean around this definition, value add to components and subcomponents with regards to assemblies to actually ensure that the product meets the designated thresholds. Next slide, please. So with regards to the designated sectors, the bidders should note that the circulation of the local content spend is comprised of a combination of designated local content prescribed with regards to the circulars that National Treasury has issued, plus non-designated local content production content with regards to extending the local content requirements over and above the regulations. So a procuring organ of state can extend the designation with the engagement with the DTI to also indicate in the bid documents other products over and above the designated sectors. And I think Gerard has alluded to these designated sectors. From what I've seen on Annexure 5A of the RFP, there's something like there are 14 designated component sectors with specific thresholds, and a lot of them relate to what has been issued by the National Treasury under the Chief Procurement Officer. So if you're looking for these instruction notes, you can find them under the Treasury website, and if you could look for the click on the Chief Procurement Officer, and you'll be able to find them. The key ones that we spoke about already now is the solar PV systems and components. We also have industrial-led acid batteries, steel power pylons, transformers. So there are quite a few with regards to also pipes that have been identified in the bid documents as part of the designated setter. Now, coming back to the verification process, so we've now established what is the requirements for local content with regards to manufacturing. And then in these documents, it then identifies the thresholds that needs to be met by the by the supplier to this contract. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is a very short and brief local content verification process. So the first step is the SABS receives information from the DTIC with regards to who has won a tender, and the documents that actually are issued to the SABS are the standard bidding document 6.2 and some annexures, and I'll just go through these annexures with regards to C, D, and E. Thereafter, the local content process would start to be engaged with the supplier, and it's a two-part process. Once an audit has been, or the process has been completed, the documentation gets presented to an approvals process. Once, again, where the threshold has been met, a certificate gets issued, and there's a database of who the suppliers that have achieved these thresholds in the designated setters that the SABS and DTI keeps. So next slide, please. So the team may have, participants may have actually seen this type of document previously. So this is the document that gets usually sent through to during the bid process, where you have to identify with regards to what is your actual local content, and it's defined as Annexure C. Effectively giving you the summary of what is your local content for the components that you actually want to tender for. With this document and the SBD document, these two documents get issued to, get submitted to the DTI and then issued to SABS to start the audit process. It's also important to note that the understanding of how to complete this document sometimes becomes quite a task. And we've later on would identify some of the challenges with regards to this. Whether this document would be part of the bid process, I'm quite sure it would be. Obviously, it's depending on the IPO office with regards to how the bid documents would be used, but this is typically in a designated sector what is expected to be submitted. The next slide, please. So Annexure D forms part of getting to Annexure C. Here we identify the suppliers expected to identify all the imported components, whether the imported components are exempted. In this regard, exemptions are normally for designated sectors requested before the tender is issued. So that is also a challenge that we found within various other sectors, is that the exemptions tend to be asked while the production activities are happening after the tender was awarded. So I think that's something to be very wary of. Then obviously in this annexure, you need to identify the imported components by the tenderer or imported by a third party. So this document basically summarizes all the imported components that actually comes into the final assembly of the product. Next slide, please. Annexure E is basically a summary or a stage what is local. So here you would identify all the local activities, be it local activities that happens at your plant or local activities for components that you actually buy from local suppliers. So these two annexures then roll up to Annexure C. Next slide, please. So the local content verification process. So once SABS receives its documents, the audit or the verification process starts. It's a two-pronged approach, but happens simultaneously. We have financial auditors who will analyze the financial transactional documents, such as the purchase orders issued by the procurer, invoices received from the first-tier suppliers to validate and verify materials depicted in the BOM or the bill of materials or the relevant annexures. So yeah, the financial auditors are basically following the money with regards to how the supplier has paid for various components that are either local or imported, and then verify that these suppliers form part of the bill of material that has been identified in Annexure C of that documents that was supplied to the DTI. In order to determine the local or imported content values of the actual invoices as per the first tier supplier, the auditors may also analyze and verify invoices received by the first tier supplier subcontractors. So effectively meaning, as David mentioned, the second and third tier of suppliers in the supply chain would have to be verified, and those invoices are followed, again, following the value or the rand value of the money. Simultaneously, the technical auditors will use the data supplied or gathered from the financial auditors to determine the capability and, in certain instances, the capacity to produce the materials or components in the manufacturing facility. And they do this by verifying the incoming materials from a certificate of compliance or certificate of analysis, verification of packaging that has been put into the production area, job cards, production orders, and sometimes witnessing manufacturing process. So here the question is, if we are in the bid phase, you haven't started manufacturing the products, how is this verification going to happen? And here we look at whether the supplier has purchased the machinery, whether they've started training people to actually do the operations within the production activities. So those are the typical things that the technical auditors will verify to ensure that there is the capability to produce these products at the facility. I must make mention in the last point there is that this is not only at the main supplier, which is the tier 1 supplier, but the verification process will follow to the second tier and sometimes third tier, and it's all based on risk. So effectively, meaning that if the component was identified as a high value component into the bill of material, then the supply chain will be followed downstream to verify if local content or local manufacturing does occur. And next slide, please. So in the end of the day, all the information gets rolled up into one calculation, and this is the calculation that's used with regards to the DTI and SABS with regards to local content. It's a very simple formula. So, and just to make mention, if a product is being produced and there's any imports or imported material used in the product, there will be no chance that you can achieve 100%. So like you can see, the X value is the imported content. So the idea is that the auditors would look at both local and imported samples, but what will happen is that the imported value will be used as the numerator, the denominator being the invoice price, and 1 minus that ratio, effectively giving you the local content percentage. So this is the formula used currently for all designated sectors, and it is one that has been consistently used, and it is the best way to identify at this time what is the local content at the manufacturing facility. Next slide, please. So after the auditors have conducted the audit and have established the local content, the auditors will then obviously prepare a report which details the samples taken and the conclusion of compliance or non-compliance with respect to the obligations of local content at the first tier of supplier, and that will be against obviously the thresholds for the designated sectors, and thereafter the information of the audit is submitted obviously to the approvals board to verify if the supplier meets the minimum thresholds. And this body is basically an oversight body, so that the due process has been followed, and the evidence that actually either indicates compliance or non-compliance has been reviewed by an independent body. It is also important to note that a local content certificate is issued, and I think this point still needs to obviously be thrashed out between the DTI and the IPO office, in the sense of the collaboration that needs still to be happening or still happen, is that this type of certificate and the expiry of it, and usually it's defined around how long the contract is and the frequency thereafter of these type of audits would have to still be determined. That means if the contract is a 5-year contract or 3-year contract, does the local content verification happen every year to ensure that the milestones are still being maintained? Because like you know, with regards to supply chain, you always have to mitigate risk, have more than one supplier that can supply a product so that you have the mitigation of risk for dual suppliers within a procurement activity. The next slide, please. Okay, so the lessons that learned during the audits that we performed or I've performed over the period, one is confidentiality. So what we find is between the second and third tier suppliers, the first tier supplier needs to formalize the confidentiality issues because at the contracting phase, because auditors are become privy to the second tier and third tier bill of materials, the whole costing process, and that becomes quite complicated. So I think it's important that we've learned the lesson that the first tier supplier or the OEM in some instances needs to ensure that there's some confidentiality and have the relevant non-disclosure agreements in place. The other lesson that we found is the shortcomings of understanding the bill of materials and the different levels of the bill of materials by the suppliers and also by the verification agency was evident in earlier verification. So, you know, with regards to a complex bill of material, like in the rolling stock, with regards to train sets and locomotives. So there's various levels of the tier of the bill of material. And to get that to a level of computing into annexes C, D, and E, as earlier shown, it requires or had required numerous interventions between the agencies doing the audit and also the supplier. So I think it's important that the first year suppliers have to, when they're completing the annexure C, D, and E, is to understand that the highest level of the BOM needs to be presented at those documents C, D, and E, but the lower level must be available from an audit perspective, because that's where the auditors will want to look at that type of information, right down to maybe even the third level of your BOM, because those are maybe the components that are importing or being imported. The other lesson that we found is the self-declarations made in annexes C, D, and E, but the second and third tier suppliers was not always a true reflection of manufacturing. What we found here to explain this further is that the fact that I've bought from Joe Soap, who is an engineering company somewhere in close vicinity, and because it's a South African registered company, the assumption made by the first tier or the second tier is that it's 100% local content. And I think, again, there it's about supply development with regards to the capabilities of your suppliers and what is actually happening with regards to their supply chain. So we found that in numerous instances, when we're getting down to the level second and third tier level of the supply chain, it was just a merchant basically getting the product in from overseas and supplying it to the next supplier, and obviously that is not no value add is actually happening to those products. The other important point that we found is that exemptions, as mentioned earlier, there was an assumption by suppliers that during the contract deployment, that means the manufacturing of the product phase, that an exemption can be requested. And what they found is that exemptions for other products that has previously been issued or other contracts was starting to be they wanted to use that in the current contract. So if I remember clearly, I'm quite sure, stand to be corrected as well here, is that when an exemption is usually given, it's given as per the specific contract that it's applicable to, or the specific tender that's applicable to. So that's something that I think the participants that are in this project needs to take heed of, because it is quite difficult to ask for an exemption or to get an approval exemption post award. Next slide, please. So some practical examples that we found that it is the completion of annexure C, D, and E can be automated by a web-based solution which tracks the local content percentage per component that forms part of the bill of materials at least at the minimum 3 levels of supply. So there are now these applications that can be used to assist the supply chain to automate their view of their local content. We also deploy technical financial auditors to help suppliers to gather this type of information. With regards to this system, the confidentiality between the supply chain remains protected, so that because the information is only given to the next or the procuring organ relating to what is the local content. So not the actual bill of material is actually submitted. What happens with this web-based program is that you have an insight into the local content at a real time. So as the local content is required to ramp up at different phases, you'll be able to view this because the input or the ramping up of the local content happens as the build program is automated. So these are typical lessons learned and practical problems that could be solved with a web-based solution to local content and supply development within a big build program. So that's it for me. So this gives you an understanding of how the process of auditing or verification happens. I stand again in saying that the SABS is the agency that conducts verifications on the designated sectors, and obviously with the support of the DTI. My organization basically just prepares the organization in light of that audit so that the audit becomes a little bit smoother, so that the understanding is very clear. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Desmond. That was very, very insightful. And I think our participants are getting a clearer idea of verification of local content. I'm certainly learning something. And we will see if you have questions for Desmond, please post them on the Q&A or chat function. We'll deal with that in the end. Thanks, Desmond. I'm going to move on to our next presentation. Of course, we wouldn't close the session without paying our bills. Enetrek South Africa is a sponsor for today's session. We really appreciate our sponsors because they make it possible for us to offer these sessions for free to the public without charging them. I saw a comment in the Q&A raising concerns about costs of training, and this is one of the moments where our sponsors make it possible for the public to participate in these sessions for free and therefore make the information more accessible. So we really appreciate that. And I'm going to hand over to Letlogonolo Muhlala from Enetrek, who's legal counsel, to tell us more about who Enetrek is, what they do, and what their view is on local value chain. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ntombi, and thank you to the previous speakers for outlining the local content requirements from a legislative perspective, and also looking at the REIPPPP RFP. Okay, next slide. Now about Enetrek. Can we just go back to the previous slide? Okay, thank you. About Enetrek, we see ourselves as transforming the renewable energy industry in South Africa. How do we do this? Through various initiatives, the most pertinent now being our involvement in the development of green hydrogen and sustainable aviation fuel. Next slide. Okay, so Enetrek was established formally in 2017. We are wholly owned by Enetrek AG in Germany. We see our business model as to keep it local, and this is evidenced by our staff complement, which is over 90% African and over 50% female. We see this as mirroring the demographics of South Africa. Next slide, please. Okay, so what do we do? Like many other developers, we are involved in most elements of the value chain, from planning, site selection, undertaking specialist studies, financial modeling, a bit of construction and O&M. Next slide. Okay, so our contribution to the local value chain. So we try by all means to hire local companies and individuals for the elements of the value chain. Other elements, prove to be difficult, especially on the construction side, as already alluded to by the other speakers. A recent example would be the risk mitigation REIPPP, having renewable energy companies fulfilling those local content requirements in respect of dispatchable power, dispatchability proved to be quite difficult, and that remains to be a challenge. Okay, next slide. Okay, so Anitra, how do we see localization? Maybe to just borrow from Maloba's words when he says localization beyond local content and having a wider area of the economy benefiting from renewable energy. What Anitra has done, we were one of the first, if not the first, renewable energy company to put up a met tower in Mpumalanga, which is of course not known for its rich wind resource, but known for other things. Mpumalanga is the heart of the energy transition, and our presence there is to spread localization to low yield areas, and not just in respect of wind, just looking at the traditional coastal regions which are rich in wind. What does our presence do in low yield areas such as Mpumalanga? One, it increases the renewable energy industry in coal region, perhaps introducing new industry players in the region, also helping to restructure existing industries to be renewable energy inclusive in that region. And the reskilling of labor, this is quite a topic in the country at the moment, with the decommissioning of the coal power stations, and promotes the just transition. That's how we broadly view localization as a business. Next slide. Okay, another important thing is the local job creation. As I've already said, our staff complement is a representation of the demographics of South Africa. We believe that we have skills available locally. This just requires commitment from renewable energy companies, the senior management, line management in these companies. At Enatrach, how do we do this? We have a very successful internship program where we pair young graduates with experienced professionals in the industry, making sure that there is that knowledge transfer and succession planning. Also, honing on to talent retention in the country. Next slide. Okay, so how do we achieve all of this? We believe in recruitment with meaning, recruiting intentionally, the intention being to impart knowledge across through career development programs, like I have already outlined what we do at Enatrach, and local company appointments in the value chain. Next slide. Okay, so if you'd like to join our team, we are hiring. You are welcome to visit our website. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Little Honolo. Thank you so much. So I'm going to now hand over to my colleague Nivershan, who's going to take us through the Q&A, pose the questions to the speakers, and facilitate that discussion, and then take us to the closing of the session. But before I do that, I just want to remind you that Windaba, which is the biggest wind energy conference in Africa, is returning to Cape Town International Convention Center on the 7th and 8th of October. Do register on our website. The registrations are open. So over to you, Nivershan.
Thank you very much, Ntombi. Indeed, a set of insightful presentations by industry leaders, as well as government officials that have given us a good dynamic of conversation that allowed us to understand or better understand local content. let us look at the opportunities within the supply chains of local content and moving the renewable energy industry forward. I think for this session, Marilis, if I can please ask that we take down the presentation. And can I ask the colleagues or the presenters to please put your cameras on so we can have a conversation with the attendees. There are a few questions. Some of the colleagues have already started answering the questions in the Q&A function, but we're going to try to address some of them with just 20 minutes remaining in the session. Let's start. Gerard, the first question is obviously to you. So the question is from an anonymous attendee. It says, South African IPPs offer some of the lowest prices in the world, and these prices continue to drop despite the 70-20 points. With localization now at 49% in round 5, with clear minimum threshold levels, why change from 70-30? Is the view that transformation is now less important? Has price once again become more important?
Thank you very much for the question. Maybe I should just again make the point here that the DTIC provides advice to the IPP office. The procurement system, the 90-10 or 70-30, is an arrangement between National Treasury and the IPP office. I think what happened here is when the first independent power program started was before Black BE legislation was really well developed. It was really in the beginning stages of localization, and they went through a number of phases. And we're getting to the point now where, and Malobo was quite clear also on that, is where Black economic empowerment becomes a gate. You either do it if you want to be part of it, and if you don't do it, you're not part of it. Localization, we want to get localization to that point as well. You either do it and then you comply, or if you don't do it, you're not part of it. So that is really the idea behind it. And then I think what the 90 level on price will do is it will ensure that we remain competitive.
Thank you very much, Gerard. Colleagues, I'm going to direct the question to one of you. If another one of you feels that you have something to add, please just use the raise hand function so we can keep the conversation going. And Toby, can I also ask you to switch on your video? You have a wealth of knowledge that we can't let go of, so please feel free to participate in this Q&A session as well. There's another question from Sydney, and maybe for Leshloko to answer this one. He says that they are a company who is active in maintenance of electrical plants, and at this stage not active in the renewable energy industry. How would they be able to access opportunities in maintenance in the sector?
Sure, okay. Yeah, a rather difficult one for an attorney, I suppose. Well, I'm not sure. I think maybe the other panelists, would they be able to help? But I mean, we are open to having discussions, you know, with the respective person who's asked the question. They can contact us directly.
Excellent. Toby, do you want to add to that, please?
Yes, no, I wanted to say that like I said before, we're running a series, and we are going to have a session at the end. I think it's the last session on operation and maintenance and business opportunities. We encourage the person who asked the question to participate in that session. That's where we're going to break down all the opportunities and how to access them.
Thanks, Ntombi. Daniel, I see your hand.
Yeah, if an input that they might consider is that operation and maintenance contracts are run either by the IPPs or by the OEMs. So that should be the two starting points to approach. The IPPs, the owners of the farms, and the OEMs, who usually sign the first 2 or 5 years operation and maintenance contract, and they can explore opportunities to outsource part of the service.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Daniel, there's a question from Jan. He says, why did the solar industry manage to localize almost 100% of the steel requirements And on wind towers, 100% of steel plates are still being imported.
That's a difficult one. Probably I will request some help from Gerard, but I think that the main contributor to that is the fact that under the Round 4 regulatory framework, the imported steel was treated as deemed if it was transformed in the country. So that was probably the main contributor to move in the direction of imported steel. I think that is clearly addressed in the Round 5 regulations, and now we will see local steel.
Gerard, from a government perspective, do you have better insight?
Well, we just very recently made a ruling that the steel used in the construction must be local. So, so that is basically what we will hope will have the IPP office will implement going forward. So going forward, it has to be 100% local.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Maloba, there's a question from Mohammed. He asked, how can we place South Africa's future renewable energy industry for exports in the case the local market face these challenges that have been discussed today?
That's a good question. I think the opportunity for exporting the sector is multifaceted, but the one huge potential that everyone is talking about, and I think the renewable energy sector in South Africa is poised to exploit, is the green hydrogen potential, right? So if we deploy large volumes of clean renewable energy and produce hydrogen, you know, we can jump into that value chain of our ports, but also using, you know, our vast resources. But I think the skills that have been developed in this country are also a huge export capacity potential. You know, so for example, Saratech in the Western Cape is training wind technicians that are in global demand. With regards to specific components and exporting, I'm definitely not in a position to comment on that. I think Gerard can weigh in terms of our global competitiveness with importing just at a general level, South African manufactured goods onto global markets. But I think our expertise in terms of the development of projects, the financing, the structuring of projects, the actual operation and maintenance and project management of those projects is a huge export capacity potential for South African-based entities, and therefore South African expertise onto the rest of the continent for sure.
Good. Gerard, anything to add to that?
I think the challenge the industry has faced over the last few years is this smooth demand. So there was some years with very high demand. It's very difficult to be competitive in that situation. So one of the things we're really trying to get home is that this industry has got a very long-term potential. It's got there's a lot of opportunities over the long term, and we must play a role, government, industry, and everybody to ensure there's smooth demand every day, every week, every month, every year. And once you get there, I'm 100% confident the industry will be very competitive and the export markets would follow.
Thanks, Gerard. Before you switch off your mic, there's another question. I think it's well suited for you from Bhavin. Bhavin says he understands that steel is required to be procured 100% from local producers. What do you foresee in the event that ArcelorMittal is unable to supply fully due to strong demand, as is the reality of the market at present?
Okay, how the designation mechanism works is if local suppliers are unable to supply, you can request a exemption for the specific tender. And in this risk mitigation round, for example, we issued exemptions for grid-tied inverters because they were not available locally. And we also issued exemptions for the aluminium frames of the PV panels. We foresee that the frames will become available in the next round, and then of course we won't issue an exemption, but if it's not available, just follow the rules and request the exemption.
Thanks, Gerard. Daniel, another question from Sydney. With regards to the local content requirements, are these determined only at bid stage or through the entire life cycle of the project?
At least from the manufacturing side, we only look at the bid requirement, not for the entire life cycle of the product.
Okay, thanks. Maloba, there's a question that says, are there any open processes in terms of localization initiatives, i.e. do local potential players have platforms to engage with large-scale players and developers, or is it based on the initiative of the potential local player to look for opportunities? So how do local players start to unlock these opportunities with the IPPs?
I think that's also a very important question. For me, the beginning of that is join the associations. Honestly, and it's not because I'm sitting on the management committee, but because by joining, you are joining calls, you are joining working groups with the same people that you're effectively wanting to do business with. And then before or in parallel with that is to inform yourselves, so the documentation, I think, is largely out there, even if you don't get the full bid documentation, but look at what the requirements are. Think about the scope of works that these various businesses will need in terms of construction and operations, and then identify those players. I think there's lots of newspaper articles, there's lots of websites with who these big players are, the mainstreams of this world, the Enertracs of this world. And, here are the people that you then reach out to and start having those conversations to say, this is where in the scope of your works, my company is able to assist towards your preferential procurement requirements, towards your ownership requirements, towards your job creation requirements. And I'm ready and available. And I think that's where it starts.
Preach. I think it's important. It's an important note because the associations house many of the bigger IPPs and the bigger players in the market. And a small investment into membership fees of an association unlocks that potential to have those conversations, to network with the right people, to be part of a community that is speaking the same language. And Toby, I see your hand.
Yes, I just wanted to add to that. It's very important, but there's also a perception that joining industry associations is expensive, but I just want to confirm that we've got a range of membership categories, and from Saweya side, we've recently created a category just for small and medium enterprises so they can be able to be part of the industry, which is quite affordable, and SMMEs can inquire about that.
Excellent. I think you've answered then the next question of how can the associations assist. From a SAPIA point of view as well, we've also created a individual membership level. So it's called PP Professional. So people in the industry looking for more information. It's really cost effective. I think we've kept the pricing down to about 20 Rand a month to be part of the membership category. And you get the latest information and you get access to communities as well. Gerard, there's another question from an anonymous attendee. He says, Gerard, I really agree with all the passion and commitment to local content and economic development, but is the crux of developing future industry not just plain supply and demand? If we do not have a guarantee of continued bids, how can the cost of manufacturing be guaranteed?
I think what I tried to illustrate in one of my earlier slides was we've got a quite interesting structure in the South African economy. The government procurement plays a big part of our gross domestic product. So in that case, it's important really to leverage this procurement to achieve the socio-economic objectives. And I fully agree, if we cannot have a continuous rollout, it's going to be very difficult to really get a substantial industry going. But I mean, we have to keep in mind, I attended the Climate Commission meeting this morning. I don't know how many of you attended that meeting, and the presentations were extremely interesting on how we have to achieve a carbon neutral economy by the mid-century. We basically have to replace all our coal-fired power stations, which basically are reaching end of life in any case. So over the next 30 years or so, these power stations will have to be replaced. If the economy starts to grow rapidly, electricity will be vital. So in my view, there is a very, very long and bright future for this industry.
Thanks, Gerard. Someone's going to have to help me with the abbreviation on this question. But just going back to the issue of BOMs and confidentiality intellectual property, do bidders have to follow the entire supply chain to the detail of all components in order to state in their proposal that what the local content is? Or are there standardized ways of accessing this information more easily? Maybe Daniel, Maloba, if you guys want to take this one.
I can actually take the first stab at it. So if we assume that it's balance of material in terms of BOM, the level at which the project developers or the bidders have to go to at bid really stops at providing the inputs on amounts of money or amounts of jobs that will be created per certain categories. Where there are specific businesses that you have already identified, you can include those, their BE levels. But the thing that is required at bid is an indication of, for example, the extent of triple BE procurement that you're going to do, the extent of Black enterprise procurement, QSE women owned. So it's up to the bidder to drill down to that degree and know, because in any case, once you become a preferred bidder and you get into the financial close process, then you do actually have to state, your specific suppliers and get those contracts in place so that you're not scrambling when you hit the shovel to the ground.
Thanks, Maloba. Daniel, something to add?
Not really. Just to clarify that BOM, I understand that is bill of materials. So
Okay.
It's the detailed packing list of the project or the equipment that needs to be supplied.
Excellent. Desmond, I see your hand up, please.
Yeah, so I just wanted to explain, the bill of materials is exactly probably what they meant from abbreviation. And around confidentiality, so based on the designated sectors, it's when you actually submit your bid, it's at the highest level of the bill of materials. So at that level, the confidentiality is pretty okay. I think it's when you start to get through the verification audit process, it's then when you need to open up that bill of material to the different levels for an audit activity, and NDAs would need to be obviously agreed upon. The concern is when you're getting down to your suppliers, and that's where it becomes a little bit conflicted with regards to how do we keep the confidentiality intact.
Thanks, Desmond. Before you switch off, there's another question. Through your presentation, there was a chat that said, can you share examples of the web-based solutions for tracking local content adherence?
Yeah, so some of the examples that I did, and I'm not too sure if it's the right forum, but it's basically keeping track of it, but outside the tier one suppliers. So effectively, the organization has an understanding of the bill of materials of their suppliers and rolled up only the local content values. So, but it's an engagement that an independent body sits outside but understands what's happening in the different in the whole supply chain of the product, so that they can roll out the local content. So there are a few examples. Unfortunately, I would not be able to give the names of the companies, but it's in a working progress of getting this web-based solution to aid suppliers on local content and how to develop their supply chain.
Excellent. Thank you for that. There's a question on upcoming sessions that I'll answer in the closing remarks. There's a question on car power ships. Gerard, you are protected in the space, so we will not be taking that question. And then the last question, Gerard, maybe to pose to you is, there's a question by anonymous attendee saying, Gerard, is the application for exemption to be done by the bidder or the solar panel / turbine company or manufacturer?
How the IPP office dealt with this is if anyone made an application and it was granted, they gave it in this risk mitigation round to everybody through a briefing note. What happened, the normal rule is that you must apply for an exemption before the bid closes. What happened in this latest round is the suppliers of aluminium frames, for example, they do not supply directly to the bidders. They supply to the PV panel industry, and that's obviously not a bidding process. So, and they were unable to supply during this period. So there are a few occasions when you're allowed to apply for an exemption after the bid closed, but the standard rule is I would say the bidder must apply before the closing date of the bid.
Excellent. Thank you for the clarity, Gerard. Desmond, your hand is still up. Is it a legacy hand or is it a new? Okay, excellent. I think with that, we will close the Q&A session. Thank you very much, colleagues, for participating on that. Just a few closing remarks from my side is we've had really great presentations. We've heard from Gerard explaining the policy framework. He touched on the designation and the Black economic empowerment requirements, the local content requirements in REIPP specifically. He's touched on the past challenges that the program has faced and the changes that we saw in the risk mitigation as well as round 5. And he also talked about the opportunities through the SAREM process, the Renewable Energy Master Plan, and the future of green hydrogen that could impact renewable energy here in South Africa. From an industry point of view, we had leaders from both solar PV and wind. Maloba focused more on the evaluation trends that we've seen in public procurement. He broke down the thresholds in detail as required. He spoke a lot about the localization, more than local content and more towards industrialization in a practical light, I think that everyone appreciated. He was clear in what industry is looking for to support policy objectives in industrialization, research-led direction that needs to come out, and how industry needs to sustain both skills and jobs in this space. He also covered a lot of the scorecard, which is a requirement of the REIPP program. Daniel took us through the past achievements of the industry, the manufacturing part of the industry particularly. He called for a conducive environment for growth. He spoke about the opportunities in the local supply chain, and again echoed the call for policy and implementation certainty, consistency, and predictability for this industry to grow and move forward. And he also provided a commitment on behalf of industry to participate, given good enough environmental or good enough conditions to promote investment in manufacturing of renewable energy. And then we closed with Desmond, who detailed the local content verification process. I think that was very insightful for all of us. A lot of us don't see what's happening behind the scenes and how these evaluations are done. So detailing those processes gives us insight as to how to structure bids and how to present information more clearly so verification processes can be done more easily. He also touched on the exemptions with practical examples, allowing the industry to learn from what has happened. Thank you again to the speakers. Thank you, a big thank you to Ntombi Futhi and the SUBIA team who's taken a lead on this, this series and this webinar topic. Guys are doing really well. Thank you to our sponsor, Enetrach, who's supported us in our past series and continue to support us. And just in terms of the upcoming webinars, we have 5 more that we'll be unpacking. It's on your screen right now. So on the 10th of June, we'll be talking to opportunities in project development phase. So what we've done is we've broken up the phases of a renewable energy project from project development all the way to operation and maintenance. So we'll be unpacking opportunities throughout that supply chain or that value chain and looking at the supply chains in each of those phases. So 10th of June, we'll be talking about project development phase. 15th of July, we'll be talking about localization opportunities in manufacturing particularly. 19th August, we're looking at opportunities in transport and logistics and everything that surrounds that. 16th September, we go into the construction phase and the opportunities that lie within engineering, procurement, and construction, actually. And then in October, we'll close out with operation and maintenance, so what happens on an operating plant and where the opportunities lie for supply chains there. I think with that, thank you for your participation. We hope to see you in all of the sessions. There are follow-on sessions. Yeah, and I won't say travel safe, you're all at home. So go well.
Thanks, Niveshan.
Thanks, Niveshan. Thanks, Ntombi.
everyone.
Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you. Bye.